The cabin in this video was built illegally. Except it wasn't. So what do I mean by that? Well, I drew up the plan, got a permit, and started building. The problem was, the county it was in instituted an ordinance that, even though my land was supposedly unrestricted, required a minimum of 672 square feet for inhabitable structures. The cabin I'm building here was about 160 square feet. So why did I build it? Let me start from the beginning. Back in the mid to late 2010s, I became interested in the off-grid and tiny house movements. Since I deal with anxiety issues that have limited my ability to work a normal job, I was very interested in the idea of alternative, less expensive modes of living. So when I found an inexpensive piece of unrestricted land, I was excited to pursue the dream. Unfortunately, it was only after I started trying to develop the land that I learned the county had coincidentally began instituting a new ordinance that required a minimum of 672 square feet, which is the size of a small trailer home in case you were wondering why the odd number. The land that you see me working on in this video is actually the second lot I bought in the same county. So you might then wonder, if I knew about the ordinance at this point, why would I buy more land in the same county? And then why would I build a cabin on it if I knew that I couldn't legally live in it? Well, the answer is pretty simple. I had never built anything before. Aside from some minimal experience helping my dad build a playhouse when I was a kid, I really didn't have any building experience. Any knowledge and confidence I had at this point was based on watching videos on YouTube. The overall size of the cabin was 8 by 12. The bottom part was going to be 8 by 8 with a 4-foot deck, and the top was going to be a 8 by 12 loft. And while I hated the idea of investing what limited funds I had into this build, I knew it would be a good idea to build something and learn from the experience before moving up to something I actually call home. I called it the price of an education. I didn't have a way to move my material, and I wasn't sure at the time how to get deliveries to a piece of land that didn't have an address. So I actually rented a U-Haul and unloaded it all by myself, and then moved all of that material down the hill. It took me about 3 days to move all of this material and get it all stacked up and organized. This was back in 2021, by the way, and I documented the process in a whole series of videos that are on this channel. As you can see, I didn't have a nail gun at the time, so all of this was done with a hammer. Now, technically this was built as a shed. When I made the plans, and what I even described it as to the county planning office, I designed this to function as a shed slash workshop slash home office type space. I was living in an apartment at the time, and I didn't have anywhere to store tools or anything, so I thought it would also be a good place to put the equipment needed to actually build a home. With that description and my building plan, I was given a permit. I designed the build to mimic what I might actually want to build as a cabin someday, because I figured that would help me learn the process better. I referred to it as the cabin shed. As you might imagine, neighboring homeowners believed that is actually what I was building, because who builds a shed on a raw piece of land after all? It's funny how quickly people jump to conclusions if you do things that are a little out of the ordinary. Now, whether or not the whole building was square is another thing. couple of years later, I met with the new head of the building department about another nearby property I was curious about at the time, and after asking some questions, he gestured to what was now my previous property. Oh yeah, I ended up selling this property, but that's another story. He said, very matter-of-factly, that it was built illegally. I didn't say anything. So I didn't have any scaffolding or anything, so I decided to take 2x6x12s that I had for the rafters and build this little bit of a scaffolding situation. It's a little bit precarious, but it worked out just fine. As you can see, moving sheets of T111 is not the easiest, especially if you're a little guy like me and you're doing it all by yourself. Just in case anyone's wondering, I don't recommend doing this when you are by yourself working on a relatively steep slope. So just in case you're wondering, I didn't buy this land and build the cabin shed on it with the sole intention of it being for practice. The idea at the time was to ultimately develop the land and build a livable cabin or tiny house on it. But plans change, and like I said, I ended up selling it. In the end, I'm happy I did it because I did learn a lot from this build. I had some trouble with this back corner. Somehow something didn't work out right. Again, very limited to no experience building, so I wasn't able to identify what the issue was, but something came out of square at this point. I sort of just kind of bulldozed through it and wasn't able to really fix it, but I just did what I could to make it work. I put together these little walk boards on the inside of the cabin so that I could get up to put in the loft joists. I have to admit my frustration, and I assume many watching this feel similarly, about our local authorities imposing arbitrary rules that inhibit people like myself, people who have limitations and needs for alternative living situations, who are willing to put in the work to achieve some form of independence from being able to do so. So the loft is partially framed in. Lifting up these 3/4 inch plywood sheets onto the loft was another little bit of a challenge working by myself. Having the joist laid out, it was time to put in the 4x4 posts to go from the bottom floor deck to support the overhang of the loft. Then I made this little makeshift ladder with a single 2x4, and that was kind of my work ladder for most of the build. I decided to build the rake walls in 2 parts, just making the flat wall bit. This is going to go from a 4 foot on the low side to 6 feet on the tall side. So I just built a standard wall and then decided to add the studs that would go up to meet the rafters separately. If I did it again, I would go back and do that differently because that wall actually caused me a lot of grief. There was a lot of challenges in getting that done. And you can see that the cut is not perfect. Like I said, I had a lot of trouble with putting these walls together, and that one being my first one, it definitely was the most janky. So we've got this piece of wall up without too much incident. Getting this last little 4-foot piece of wall in was a little bit more work than I had anticipated, but we got it. With all that done, I could put on the final top plate and then start working on my rafters. The first rafter I made actually was a horrible cut, but it gave me a good idea of how to go about it. So once I learned how to cut a proper rafter, I started making all my cuts and made a template and then cut all the rest of them from that one. As you can see on the rake wall, I added some extra little supports because my studs didn't go up the way they were supposed to. I tried to do whatever I could think of to do this right, even though it was a practice build. So as you can see, I put hurricane ties on the rafters. Since I was doing a metal roof, I got some 1x4s and started adding the strapping. If I could go back, I would have put in some kind of plastic to separate the metal roofing from the interior of the cabin. And here we are. So when the roof goes on, it should be laying flush on all this and there won't be a gap. I put in the first sheet of the metal roofing and tried to make sure that was lined up the best I could. Actually, what you don't see here is I had laid out all of the sheets across the roof to try and make sure I got things lined up so that the ends wouldn't do any kind of sawtoothing. And then I moved them all back down and then screwed in the first sheet. With the roof on, I decided to go ahead and start working on the final touches, which is this front side of the cabin, getting the door notch cut out, and then putting the T111 sheathing on. This was a bit stressful, trying to make sure these little thin cuts of the T111 didn't crack or break on me. Unfortunately, with the final piece here, I had a little bit of trouble. And what you can't see on camera there is that fall made that little piece on the bottom of the door framing area break off. So I ended up having to nail that separately. You can kind of see there on the bottom right where the crack is from that fall. Now with the front wall up, I decided it was time to put a door in. I didn't really have a solid plan for how I was going to make a door, but I just was curious to try it myself and see what I could come up with. So I got these 1x4 furring strips and basically just measured the hole for the wall and tried to line it up the best I could. One mistake I made here was thinking that I could make a frame and it would be held together by itself. And these were just like little, manual pin nails that I put it together with. Ultimately, I had to go back and add a thin sheet of plywood to the back of it, and then I used some screws to reinforce it, but we got a usable door out of it. Alright, so this is what we're dealing with. My first attempt at making a door. The door is functioning. You have to kind of pull it tight, lock it. Feels pretty solid. And once again, we're back with the janky scaffolding in order to get up and finish nailing off the siding of the T111 there. And with all the siding up, it was time to stain the building. Now, one thing I did not anticipate or know was that T111 is basically a sponge for stain. And unfortunately, that ended up costing me the actual color that I wanted to go with. This was a mahogany stain, and it kind of dried to a very orangish hue. You'll notice when I paint the interior grooves here with the paintbrush, it goes on a little bit thicker and doesn't absorb as much, so they ended up being a lot darker, and the grooves there are actually the color that I was hoping to make the whole cabin. Unfortunately, the stain was pretty expensive, and I wasn't really interested in going and buying another bucket to do another coat, as well as it was just way too much work for the steep slope that I was working on and the height of this cabin. Then I had some walnut stain that I used for the trim here. Thought the colors might complement each other, so I did walnut on all the trim and the mahogany on the siding. And I felt like the result ended up pretty good. If I had just gotten the actual color that I wanted on the siding, I think it would have worked even better. But as you can see, there's the finished door and the finished color of the building. Now I had this idea to make a more permanent ladder slash staircase thing for the interior. And what I wanted to do is take these two 2x6s, and as you can see, I sistered them together. I'm drilling out holes for the rungs of the ladder. Well, it's been an arduous few hours, but I got all the holes cut out. Now, this didn't go together smoothly. I had to finesse it a bit, but we ultimately got a pretty heavy-duty and secure ladder. I felt like this is probably the safest you could feel on a ladder, especially a homemade one by someone who's never made one before. And I took some brackets and actually secured it to the joists so that you didn't have to worry about the ladder trying to fall down. So the idea with this build was that I was going to use it as a kind of off-grid office cabin slash workshop. So as you can see, I'm insulating the loft area. The hope was that I would eventually use this maybe to go stay at, to camp and kind of practice the off-grid living lifestyle. Of course, it's a bit dark up there, so I needed to put a window in. Light! This was basically just a cheap playhouse window that I ordered off of Amazon. It fits! And with the window done, I used the expanding foam spray and sealed up all the little gaps around the roof. And then it was time to insulate. The little slap stapler that I got was pretty unwieldy. It was a bit challenging to use that and get consistent staples that stuck and held everything up properly, but I eventually kind of got the hang of it. So as you can see, the insulation is finally in, and I used the scrap T111 that I had to cover in the bottom of the loft there. Finished off staining it, and this was just using the walnut stain that I had left over. Well, there it is. We had some crazy winds last night. Looks like she held up to the storm. So there you have it. For a first build, I feel like I did an okay job. There are definitely things I would have changed if I could go back and redo it. But at this point, I've not been able to continue my pursuit of the dream of building my own home. In the meantime, I'm going to focus on making more builds and spending some time trying to gain experience. If that interests you, feel free to subscribe to the channel and follow along. Regardless though, thanks for watching.